Hi, Annette. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Tom. Thank you. We're just going to go live, Tom. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Thank you. A few nods. Thank you very much. My name is Mike Warden, and I'm one of the inspectors appointed, along with my colleague, Mrs. Yvonne Wright, by the Secretary of State, to examine the Brentwood local plan. Most of the participants have been to previous sessions, but some of you haven't. So for those, it's your first session, welcome. And I will run through some housekeeping messages. Can I first of all introduce my colleague inspector, Mrs. Yvonne Wright?
Good morning, everybody.
And I'd also just like to introduce Annette Feeney, who most of you have already met.
Morning.
Annette is the programme officer, and Annette will be assisting you really in terms of any technical or procedural matters today. So if you've got any issues or questions relating to those, then please take those up with Annette, and she will do her best to help you. In terms of when you wish to speak, please use the raise your hand function, and we will note that you wish to speak and bring you into the discussion. If I've not spotted you, then please feel free to raise your hand on the video. But generally, to date, we've not needed that. When you are speaking, it's helpful to have your camera on. You don't have to, but it's helpful to the discussion. And also, when you're not speaking, can you please make sure that your microphone is muted? And also, it'd be helpful as well if you turn your mobile phones to silent so that they don't disturb us when we're having discussion. There are a number of sites to go through this morning, and we will be taking them in order in as we've set out in our questions. And we're dealing with matter 7E, site allocations relating to the urban neighbourhoods. We will take a break during the morning session. We're due to finish this morning session at 11:30. We'll see how we go in terms of whether we have a break before then. But we will then finish this session by 11:30, and the West Horndon session is due to start at 12 o'clock. Are there any questions from anybody, particularly from those who are new to us today, whether you've got any questions in relation to process? Okay, thank you. So this morning's session is matter 7E, urban neighbourhoods, and we shall run through the sites, as I said, in order of them being set out in our questions. So we'll start off with the Ford HQ and Council Depot at Worley, then the Sow and Grow site at Pilgrim's Hatch, then land at Maskell's Lane, Worley, then land at Worley Hill, and then land off Donninghurst Road. Can I just go through the introductions for people, just to make sure that we've got everybody here who is expected to be here, and also that your camera and microphone work. Can I ask the council to introduce themselves, please?
Yes, good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Shadarevian, QC, and acting for the council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, inspectors. It's Tom Huang, Senior Policy Planner at Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you. And then we should have the Amiga family and Mrs. Dunbar.
Yes, good morning, sir. John Dagg, barrister, acting on Sow and Go and Mrs. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Dagg. Essex County Council, we should have Mr. Johnson.
Good morning, Inspector. Brendan Johnson, Essex County Council, Local Highway Authority.
Mr. Johnson, I understand that the Essex County Council will have to leave early on the later sessions, but you are going to be here for this
Yes,
7E session.
I've basically got to get to hospital by 1:30. But it's only 10 minutes up the road, so hopefully I should be able to cover all the morning sessions.
Thank you. If there's anything that you wish to say that you've not said when you have to leave, then please let me know.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And we can bring you in. For the Essex Partnership University NHS Trust.
Thank you. Good morning, inspectors. It's Stephen Butler from Bidwells, representing Essex Partnership University NHS Trust in respect of the proposed allocation policy R09 at Worley Hill.
Thank you. Countryside Properties.
Yep, good morning, inspectors. It's Laura Dudley-Smith here from Stratton Parker, representing Countryside Properties in respect of the land allocated at Doddinghurst Road under policy R16 and 17. I am also joined today behind the scenes, I suppose, by Carl Glossop, representative of Countryside Properties, and I'll be sure to introduce him if there's any points that's worth making directly on behalf of the developer.
Thank you. And
yes, so good morning, Inspector. I'm Carl Glossop, Planning Manager at Countryside Properties, and like Laura said, I'll be assisting if and when required.
Thank you, Mr. Glossop. And Councillor Minot. Okay.
Yes, good morning. This is Councillor Minot.
Good morning.
Not representing anybody specifically.
So am I to refer to you as Councillor Minot or Mr. Minot today?
I think I'm technically not a councillor. I'm not acting as a councillor at this point, although obviously I'm drawing from my experience as a councillor. But I'm not any kind of an official representative.
So shall I call you Mr.
Mr. Minot is fine.
Okay. Thank you. Is there anybody here who I've not asked to speak? No, that's good. So we shall go through a number of questions in relation to the sites, and a lot of the questions will be fairly consistent between the sites. I will lead this morning's session, and my colleague Mrs. Wright may have some questions as well, and may join the discussion to come in to ask questions. As Mrs. Wright explained at the end of yesterday's session, one of the things that we do want to hear about on those sites that are present in the green belt is to understand what the exceptional circumstances are that have led to those sites being proposed to be released from the green belt. And we shall also ask questions relating to general site information. So we'll ask just a little bit about each site. We shall ask about constraints, relationship to local area, neighbouring sites. We look about capacity, deliverability, and policy wording as well, where some of the sites have some more detailed policy wording than others. It would be very helpful if the council were to be able to highlight the relevant and the most up-to-date documents, because there have been a number of documents and different stages and positions really taken on each site. So as we go through, it'd be really helpful if the council could refer to those documents. For example, we've got focus changes on some sites. We've got suggested main modifications. There's some suggested policy wording changes in statements, and also we've got statements of common ground which have been coming in over the last week or so. So also, please don't feel afraid to refer to a document to the library if you think it would aid the discussion. Thank you. Is there any questions from anybody in respect of that? Thank you. Can we then turn to the first site, please, which is R04 and R05, two sites together, the Ford headquarters and the council depot at Worley. Can I ask the council just to just introduce the site for me, please, and just tell me a little bit about the site, and the current position. There is a statement of common ground between the council and Fairview, which is helpful. But I just ask a brief introduction from the council, please.
Thank you, Inspector. So yes, in terms of the RO4 and RO5 allocation, that, as you mentioned, they do make up the former Ford headquarters and the council depot. So the Ford headquarters, say former, the Ford building has been now vacated. So Ford's UK headquarters have been moved to Dunton in Basildon. And since that time, the main building has been subject to a prior approval for conversion to from offices to residential. So that part of the site is in effect now accounted for within the permitted development pile in terms of our calculations. So obviously in terms of document F26 that we submitted last year, that provided an update in terms of the numbers that were associated with the allocation. So the remaining land, so there's some land to the east of the Ford headquarters building, which is to the south of the main road, Eagle Way. So that is that land plus the car park land, which was associated with the Ford headquarters, which is to the north of Eagle Way. Eagle Drive, but apologies, at the main road. Those two parcels are being promoted by Fairview New Homes and is currently subject to a live application which has been submitted already. That also comprises within it some proposals for a care home, which is something that's obviously stipulated within the plot policy. Now, in terms of the other parcel, which is the council depot, that the council land also includes there's a Ford service centre which the council owns the land for and leases that out. So that comprises part of the land ownership of the council. So in terms of the surrounding uses to the south, or to the east, north and south of the site, there is greenbelt land, notwithstanding the existing care home on the eastern side of the Ford car park, which is obviously within the urban area. We've also got the, I believe it's the Territorial Army buildings on the western side of the Ford headquarters building. And then we've got existing residential development, including Keys Hall Shopping Parade on the parcel of land to the northwest, or east of the northern parcel. So there are, in terms of just referring back to the Territorial Army buildings, there are some listed buildings there. So there is a chapel associated with it. I think the main building is also a listed building, and obviously they're sort of nearby to the existing headquarter building. But that a quick run through there. But happy to pick up on any other points that you may wish to raise in respect of the existing surroundings.
Thank you. So the prior notification that relates to the existing building, that is for 325 units.
That's correct, yes.
And so what you've done in relation to the F26 housing trajectory update is taken those out and effectively put them into the sites with planning permission.
That's
so
correct.
that there remains 148 then
Yes.
to be allocated, effectively to be allocated.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, in relation to the existing building,
Mm-hmm.
what is the position in terms of a start being made on that to convert that building?
As we understand, there are works ongoing in terms of converting that building. I believe it's in progress, I think, at this stage, not by no means near complete. But that is something that is obviously being progressed by the now owners of that building. So yeah, that will comprise, obviously, like I say, conversion into significant number of apartments for that building, and utilising the existing surrounding space for that.
And I think that those works have to be completed within 3 years, so January 2023. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
So the updated trajectory will reflects that in terms of when those units are expected to be delivered?
Yes, I mean they're like I say, they're included in
Planning
the.
permission.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. So they're part of the monitoring information that feeds into that effectively. So we have the updated monitoring that we submitted that includes those numbers.
Okay. So the remaining part of the site is subject to a planning application that was submitted in August.
Yes.
What is the what's the current position in terms of processing that planning application? Where is it up to?
Yeah, so I think it's in terms of the application. Obviously, it's been going through obviously a number of revisions, I believe, in terms of looking at the obviously the layouts of the development in more detail that have been required. So I think there have been ongoing discussions in respect of that. The element of the care home that's on that southern parcel is, I think it's part outline. So in effect, there's a sort of different position in respect of that part of the site. But there is the intention for obviously for that to be proceed to determination in the short term. I haven't necessarily got a specific date when that will be determined, but it will be within the next 6 months, I would say.
Is there a planning performance agreement in relation to the application?
Yes, as I understand it, there is, yes.
And the application is in two parcels, and that there's basically the southern bit to the east of the building,
yes,
and the northern bit. But it doesn't extend onto the council depot. So, but on the submitted master plan, there is housing shown on that site. So, what is the current thinking in respect of the council depot? And I'm interested to know how that remaining part of the allocation, proposed allocation outside of the application, relates to the requirement to provide employment on the overall allocation.
Thank you, Inspector. If I take those questions, the council, when discussing with the applicant of the non-council land, discuss the extent to which that master plan requirement within the emerging policy could be considered by looking at what would come forward on the applicant's land and how that may affect the council land in terms of trying to bring those two sites forward. And as we set out in our hearing statement, the intention of that overall master plan approach would be to look at the two land ownerships holistically, given that at the moment the only sort of defining boundary between the two land ownerships is essentially a fence in a car park, so nothing of any great permanence. And so what we wanted to try and do with the applicant was to ask them to provide something that considers what they could bring forward on their land that would then be able to be extended or have a relationship with what the council could develop on its land in terms of the other land ownership. So thereby we would not be looking at an application as we have currently that would be inconsistent potentially with anything that could come forward with on the council's land. The reason for the fact that the current application does not include development on the council's land is purely one of timing in terms of some of the questions that you've set out and we've responded to in the hearing statements around either the relocation or redevelopment of the council depot facility on the council's land and the way in which that would be considered as part of any future redevelopment. But the council has been clear for a long time now through its corporate strategy and indeed through the emerging local plan over various revisions that is a piece of land considered to be an asset for the council that would be good to utilise in terms of bringing forward development that meets local needs and the way in which we do that. And so what we've tried to do in the policy is reflect something of what could come forward on that land, taking account of whether the depot could be retained on that site or indeed relocated, as we've set out. So the intention of that master plan was to show how a scheme could come forward purely for housing land that would be consistent with what is coming forward from the applicant at the moment with the current application.
So if the application is approved, and that together with the depot build, with the HQ building, then the numbers expected in terms of the policy would be met in terms of houses. So yes, yeah. So the remaining land, which is the council's remaining part of the site, is that then where it is expected that the employment, the 2 hectares of employment, as envisaged in the policy, would be located?
If there is no employment coming forward on the applicant's land in that scenario as being proposed through that master plan, then yes is the answer.
So it's not a question that there could be more houses coming forward or being looked to come forward?
I think the number that we've looked at is cautious in terms of what we think is realistic that would come forward. Provision of that level of employment land on the council's site could still bring forward housing as part of that, dependent on the way in which it's designed clearly. So we would say that number that is set out within the policy is the minimum that will come forward as part of that redevelopment. It may be that additional housing land could come forward once a scheme is finalised for that site, and indeed to consider the wider area and wider redevelopment opportunities that may come from that.
Thank you. I think just in terms of the planning application, there's also reference to some retail within that application or centre. So how does that how would that relate to the application of this policy in relation to that application?
I believe reference to retail coming forward is mainly in relation to reinvigorating or investing in the existing retail facilities that are just over the road. On the other side, essentially to the east of the site, where there are existing retail for a small local parade at, I forget the name off the top of my head, Keys Hall Shopping Parade. So the intention there, again, in terms of my comment there about the wider opportunities for growth, would be to see development in this location to support that retail and potentially invest in that retail in terms of what could come forward by way of improvement.
But if that application was considered with the retail element in it, would that application be inconsistent with the policy which has been proposed?
Sorry, Inspector. No, I don't believe it would be inconsistent, and I would need to check the exact details of the application as to whether there's retail being proposed as part of the site. My understanding is that it is to support retail that is already there.
Okay. Can you just tell me a little bit about the listed buildings that I think relate to the west of the Ford headquarters, and what's their relationship to the site, and how do they have an impact upon how the site is developed?
Thank you, Inspector. I would say obviously the relationship is more westward facing to, in terms of the former Territorial Army use of the site. I mean, obviously the site in itself has a longer history. It was used as the Worley Barracks. So the Ford building before that was there was the barracks there, and obviously there's a strong relationship in terms of that local area. But the actual the TA's, the Territorial Army site, is very well screened off for security reasons, obviously, in terms of the way that operates. So its relationship is somewhat inward facing, but certainly those buildings do have a strong relationship with the local area. And I would say, obviously, the more recent history is the Ford building, and obviously that being retained is equally a part of more recent history of the local area, although that's not listed, obviously, but certainly to be retained. But I would say, in terms of the site coming forward, the consideration of that wider setting is certainly something that we've identified within the policies, and that's merely obviously a consideration of that in terms of the local context for the area. And as I understand, in terms of how the Fairview application has come forward, obviously their planning analysis of the site has considered that wider, the longer term history and the use of the land, and how that potentially relates in terms of relationship with design and layout, for example, to the extent that it can do. But certainly it's been considered.
Thank you. And how does the land, the policy refers to the local wildlife sites at Barrettwood and Donkey Lane? How do they relate to the design of the site, for example, and consideration of the site? Sure.
So that they are on the boundaries. And I suppose the other thing, apologies, I omitted from the beginning of the description of the site, the boundary of the allocation, and the difference between that and the ownership. So there is a piece of greenbelt land, effectively, that sits on the eastern boundary of the Ford headquarter parcel to the south, and that would be retained as such. That's not to be taken out of the greenbelt. And obviously, in terms of that use of that land would be retained for recreational purposes, which at the moment it's not able to. Now that obviously abuts against the local wildlife site area, or the woodland area of Faundham Wood. And they are, at the moment, I believe they're fenced off in terms, obviously, of the way that the Ford site has been fenced off in terms of its boundaries, in terms of security. So I think certainly there are opportunities in terms of access. I think obviously that relationship is important, whereby there's obviously other roads that go to the south, very minor roads, but the Worley Gap that they go down towards, and I think that sort of the accessibility of that is something that would need to be considered. And again, in terms of actually flagging those items up, it's important to do so, because obviously they are adjoining the site and they'll be considered as part of the application. In terms of any enhancements, I think is probably the key thing, as opposed to being any detrimental impact as we see it.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of taking the site forward, what are the main constraints in terms of the site? Is there site clearance issues? Is it matters about any potential contamination?
Not as far as we're aware. No, in terms of as I mentioned, obviously with the main Ford building being converted, there's no demolition involved regarding that. There is the demolition required of another part of that building, which is called the data centre, which has been vacated for some time whilst Ford were there. So that would be one element that would need to be demolished. That's a more recent addition, I think, in the 1990s. The land to the north, with regards to the Ford element, it merely comprises a open car park. So from that perspective, there is tarmac to clear, but no actual physical buildings, and there's only fencing around the edge of that site. In terms of the council depot land, clearly there's, as we mentioned earlier, there is a need to look at that in terms of the remodelling of that site potentially, or relocation. And there obviously would need to be some consideration of the current use of that site as a waste depot. So certainly there'll need to be contaminated land assessments carried out on that particular element. But in terms of bringing forward the application as it sits at the moment, there's no indication of that being an issue.
Thank you. So in the statement of common ground that has been submitted, there is no, in some statements of common ground, you've looked at the housing trajectory and looking to revise the housing trajectory. But can you just explain, it doesn't appear that, unless I've missed it, that this is the case on this site. is that the case, that you're still expecting that the housing trajectory set out in F26 is as the position now expected to deliver?
Yes, thank you. Yes, you're correct that there isn't an updated trajectory within this statement of common ground. I think that the view in the discussions that we've had with, in particular with Fairview, obviously with them advancing their current application, that their view that could be determined in time for delivery to be brought forward. I think happy to be open to, obviously, in respect of obviously other sites where we have taken that view, where I think we accept that the 2021-22 period is going to be difficult, obviously, except with the exception, obviously, with regards to this site not being a greenbelt site, so not necessarily dependent upon the plan being adopted to get approval. But certainly there's obviously consideration of those ongoing, the emerging policies as they go forwards. But I think from our perspective and just from the view of the developer, that they feel that that's an achievable position.
Yeah, because that's my next question really, is that the trajectory shows 25 units in 21-22, but you said that you thought the plan application could be determined within the next 6 months. I'm just questioning whether that's actually realistic, that then that application could be determined and there could be delivery of 25 units within 21-22.
Certainly. Yeah, I can see that viewpoint. I mean, in terms of if it was to be, in terms of the trajectory to be amended to show it from 2022-23, I think that would be still an acceptable position from our stance, because that would still fall within the 5-year delivery period, which I think is obviously one of the key things that we're trying to establish. So certainly, if that's something that we can consider in terms of, I suppose at the point to outline, I suppose if there is, obviously there are a number of other, as we go through other sites, some updates through the statements of common ground in respect of those start times or delivery timeframes, and obviously I would expect you'd want to see an updated trajectory following those discussions. So certainly I think that's something we could consider.
And then what would that mean for the 2 years? Is it expected that would just go back a year, or go back to start a year later, or is it given where we are in respect of the planning application and the works to be done on site, is it realistic that the site could start in 22-23?
I think we think that it is realistic in terms of the sort of that determination periods. Saying that it can be done within the next 6 months is, again, us being, I think, cautious. There's every prospect that it could well come to committee in March. It depends very much on the election cycles coming up as to when those committees meet, as to why we've said that 6-month period, but it should be determined very soon. And certainly if units can't be delivered within this year, then we would expect that work can begin on site very quickly. As we've said, there's not a huge amount of clearance or anything else that is required in terms of getting on with the work. So other than the development management processes of working through sign-offs and conditions and such, then we believe that it can start soon.
And so therefore, your position would probably be that, if I'm understanding it, it'd probably be more realistic to move that back to 25 units in 22-23, and then is it the council's position that would be 50, then 73 for those following years?
Yes, that would be our view.
And why do you draw on 50 and 73 in terms of those deliveries over those 2 years? I mean, what points to that number of houses being delivered over those 2 years rather than, for example, a longer period of time?
I think it's been informed, obviously, by the application that's been coming forwards in terms of those delivery timeframes and what can come forward in each given year. I do accept that they are very specific numbers. For example, the 73. but I don't think that they're unrealistic in terms of there may well be some variance, and I think we can probably accept that every site may well have some variance on annual deliveries, but I don't think they represent an unrealistic prospect. So I think in terms of the amount that could come forward on those, and bearing in mind that there will be some additional 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. So obviously when they're being built, the actual building itself may take some time, but once they're completed, you get a significant number in one go. So I think that the achievement of that has realism behind it. I feel, based on previous experience with other sites.
And is it that in year 3 of the development, for example, there would be development on the south side and on the north side of the road?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the phasing of that site will obviously need to be. There'll be obviously an element of clearance on the southern side, more so than the northern side. So I expect that would probably be coming forward in concurrently. And obviously there's different types of units that will be delivered as part of that scheme. So I expect the developer will want to make sure that they're brought forward in a manner which offers a good range of different types of tenure units that people can purchase. So certainly there will be an element of phasing. I'm not exactly sure on the exact timings of when exact parcels will be released, but that'll be my understanding.
Thank you. Just going back, looking at the statements of common ground, there's a reference to outstanding matter, and it relates back to employment. And can you just explain what you understand to be the outstanding matter? Because it says that there's an objection to floor space. Is that objection to existing floor space, or objection in relation to the 2 hectares that is expected in the allocation?
Yeah, I think this comes back to the difference, excuse me, between Fairview and obviously the council land. Obviously, regarding this is a statement of common ground with Fairview in respect of their element of the allocation. So I think from their perspective that the employment land could obviously come forward on their land. There is elements of that being brought forward, as you mentioned earlier, about its employment generating uses, I suppose, is what their perspective is in terms of the relatively small scale retail that could be brought forwards, obviously notwithstanding the improvements to Keys Hall. But I think in terms of the actual allocation, we still, as we mentioned earlier, I think we still feel that 2 hectares is achievable in terms of the council depot land and the Ford headquarters site. So I think that's merely a point that the developers of Fairview wanted to raise in respect of their consideration, that they feel that the 2 hectares would be better placed on the council depot land.
And is there a development agreement between the council and Fairview? Is that in preparation, or is one expected?
Certainly, there have been ongoing discussions. So, as mentioned earlier, there have been those discussions between the council corporately and the developers or council as landowners. So, yeah, certainly that's an ongoing discussion in respect of, as we mentioned, in terms of the work going forwards. There is a commitment for the council depot to be either remodelled or relocated. And obviously, as part of that, the council would want to, as part of its corporate strategy, want to make sure that there is elements of employment on that site. And if that's the case, that they're able to control that through their land ownership, then I think that would still be compatible with the policy.
Okay. And the development on the site envisaged is being worked up fairly detailedly through the plan application. But what is the site viable for what is proposed?
Yes, and in terms of what we're, in terms of going back to obviously what the evidence that supports the plan, the viability assessment confirms that obviously all the sites, but including this site, are viable based on the requirements of the policies. So yeah, in terms of the site in itself, as it's coming forward now, in terms of the Fairview proposals, they are considering that to be a viable prospect.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions on that. I think Mrs. Wright might have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. It's just in relation to the statement of common ground with Fairview and the other outstanding matter, which is in relation to the 5% custom build housing across the site that's required as part of the policy. Can the council just explain your reasoning as to why for this site you feel that it is a requirement and should be brought forward on this site?
Thank you, Inspector. Yes, so I think this is, or in terms of what we set out for the strategic site, so this includes the Ford headquarters site, the land north of Shenfield, West Horn Industrial Estate and Dunton Hills Garden Village. In a similar fashion to as we discussed yesterday in respect of care home provision, or specifically identifying that larger sites could accommodate that. This is where we've identified that these sites could be specifically providing those types of uses, so that the custom and self-build. So I think obviously the difference between ourselves and Fairview, I think really more relates back to the actual policy that obviously requires that, notwithstanding the fact that we have obviously specifically set it out within the site policy as well. So I think we've had similar points raised, and we'll come on to them in terms of those other sites I just mentioned, where there's a view that there should be perhaps the policy requirement should be relied upon as opposed to just stipulating it on the specific site policies. But I think from our perspective, as I say, we feel that it's relevant to include it on these strategic site policies.
Can you just let me know what the numbers would be?
I may need to check on that.
And I'm assuming this, because obviously the policy is for the entire site, but obviously some of the site is now has permitted development, as Mr. Warden's already gone through. So is there self-build and custom build on that part of the site, or is this 5% now purely on the Fairview and the council-owned site?
Yes, so in terms of the elements, the conversion of the building is now effectively assumed permitted, so that would be taken out of the equation in respect of the policy as it's going forwards. So the 5% would apply to the remaining numbers that we're now setting out in the F26 trajectory. So that's,
and what would be that number for this site, just so that I'm aware? We're not allowed to do our own calculations.
No, that's fair enough.
Calculation, but
Sorry, yeah.
I know what the number is, but we're not allowed to actually just do our own calculations.
I think it's around 14 units.
Thank you. And so the way the council, and you did explain it yesterday in relation to care home provision, and I'm sure we'll come on to that as well later on other sites. Is there an identified need from a self-build perspective or a custom build perspective for this provision in this location from your register that you have? Has that been identified?
I think that the register obviously identifies a number of people that have interest in bringing forward self-build, and I think a lot of them are within, in general terms, I'm not talking necessarily specifically this site, but they are talking in general terms about the desire for the Brentwood urban area. I suppose obviously because of the potential affordability issues from their perspective, that they wish to build their own home in that location. Equally, I think obviously it's fair to say, and it's probably maybe similar to lots of other areas where there is a desire for people to build a home singly in the countryside, which from a greenbelt perspective we wouldn't be able to unfortunately accommodate, but I think in terms of the actual general demand, and obviously the demand is assessed across the borough, that we feel that this would provide a good opportunity in this location, which, bearing in mind it's an urban fringe site, that would provide that opportunity for people to be in a sustainable location, which is accessing existing services. So we feel that is an appropriate identification.
And is there, again, just remind me on the policy, is there provision to allow, because should these sites for self-build, if they are provided in accordance with the policy, if then they're not taken up, is there provision for those sites to be utilised for other means or other forms of housing?
I don't think it necessarily specifically sets that out within the site policy, but in terms of the self-build, apologies, just looking.
No, that's what it's. This it's not the main. It's not the site allocation policy. It's the other policy, isn't it?
No, yeah, understood.
Specific.
Turning to that page.
Yeah, if you can just remind me of that, and then.
I mean, it could well be a case that there's a clawback put in within the Section 106 agreement. I guess that's one aspect that could be a mechanism, notwithstanding any policy requirements.
We will be coming back to, because we obviously haven't dealt with HPO1 yet. We will be dealing with that when we come to Matter 8. Mm-hmm. So maybe something to just have a look at in the interim, because I don't want to... Mr. Warden's got an awful lot of sites to get through this morning, so I think we ought to move on. But maybe that's something that you can consider, and we'll have a discussion about on Matter 8 next week.
Okay.
We'll do that.
Lovely. Thank you, Mr. Warden. That's all the questions I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. Is there any participants who've got any points they wish to make on this site? No. Can we therefore move on to the R07, please, the Sow and Grow nursery site? This is a greenbelt site. So can the council please just introduce the site, and also please set out what are the exceptional circumstances that justify the release of this site from the greenbelt?
Thank you, Inspector. So yes, as you mentioned, this is a greenbelt site. The site comprises part brownfield land in respect of an existing garden nursery, hence the name Sow and Grow Nursery. There's also an accompanying, I believe, a timber business. Mr. Dagg may better correct me on that one, but so that makes up the majority of the site. There is another element to the north. So there's two separate land ownerships. There's the Armiger family to the south, and Miss Dunbar to the north. To the obviously the site faces onto Ongar Road, which is within Pilgrim's Hatch. So Ongar Road being the main road, A128 going north-south through the borough. To the rear of the site, so on the western boundary, there is some existing allotments that sort of frame the site, and then to the south there's some countryside land. In terms of the exceptional circumstances, the site was assessed within the Greenbelt study as having a low impact on Greenbelt, and residential development of this site is considered to be appropriate due to the location of the site being adjacent to Pilgrim's Hatch, which is part of the main urban area. The site is previously developed, as mentioned, and would separate from the countryside by existing development to the north, allotments to the west, and established field boundaries to the south. And the site makes minimal contribution in terms of achieving Greenbelt purposes, which is a factor that goes towards demonstrating exceptional circumstances as to why we feel this particular parcel has been chosen for release. Happy to pick up on any other points on that if there's any questions.
Thank you. Can you just can we just look at the boundaries, Inspector, from a Greenbelt perspective then? So,
yep.
To the south, it looks a fairly well-defined boundary to the south of the site onto open fields, and then to the west, the allotments would remain in the Greenbelt.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
And what then happens in terms of the northern boundary? What defines the northern boundary?
So there's the parcel. So when looking at the satellite image of the site, like I said, there is the two ownerships, and I believe that the parcel to the north is obviously part of what Miss Dunbar owns and is part of the allocation. So in effect, there's the existing development along Ongar Road to that northern part of that parcel, which would abut the site. accepting obviously that is still in itself within the greenbelt. But obviously there will be no opportunities for development to creep further north because there is already existing development there.
And the road itself is currently within the greenbelt as outside the site, and it's proposed that remains in the greenbelt.
I believe there was updated boundary map, so just trying to find the reference, but we did submit an additional document which established the exceptional circumstances for those minor slivers of land that we added into the boundary. So we recognise that does need to come out to enable it to be connected to the existing urban area. So just apologies, just trying to find the reference for you. It's more recently submitted. It was document F56.
Thank you. Can you just explain how the capacity of the site has been arrived at? And I'm particularly interested in the relationship in respect of the greenbelt boundaries, and particularly the relationship between along the western side between the site and the allotments. How is the site? How have you arrived at 38 dwellings?
Certainly. So in terms of the history of this site, there have been previous pre-application discussions that have taken place. Obviously, they're not necessarily in the public domain, but they have been taking place in the past. And there were the original schemes that were drawn up for that site in respect of what could be brought forward. Obviously, the overlying factor that prevented that coming forward is the fact that it's within the greenbelt, so it wasn't advanced to application at that stage. But certainly that give an indication or an indicative view on what the potential capacity of that site was. And certainly the relationship, I think, to the west of the site is important. But I think obviously at the moment there is that established boundary already in place between them, whereby it's not necessarily open to the rear of the site. So there would obviously need to be consideration of that in further discussions going forwards, but there certainly is considered to be an achievable prospect.
Thank you. I could just come on to the Statements of Common Ground updates the trajectory and suggests that 38 dwellings could come forward in 22-23. Mm-hmm. What is the current position in respect of the site activities at the moment, and what evidence is there that that site could start delivering from 22-23? And happy for Mr. Dagg to come in here if he can assist.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I can. One of the reasons that our clients were anxious that we did contribute to this session was just to reassure you that the site is indeed deliverable in the short term. As Mr. Quilter has already said, most of the site is in commercial use at the moment. Of course, it's on the brownfield register, on part one of the brownfield register. That's the sow and grow nursery site, strictly speaking. It was, of course, as the name suggests, a nursery. But as has happened with a lot of nursery sites, effectively what happened was that it gradually transformed into a general commercial site. I think that's a fair summary. But the uses on it are putting it rather colloquially, they are fairly easy to clear. That's to say that the site owners, so far as the sow and grow portion of the site is concerned, the portion of the allocation is concerned, they've been very careful to ensure that there's no security of tenure given to the existing commercial occupiers. Mr. Quilter mentioned a timber business. That's right. It's effectively a yard activity with a lot of stacked material. This is obvious, in fact, just from a glance from the Ongar Road. And of course, there are a number of buildings on there, but they're all light timber buildings. One's not dealing here with a major problem in terms of site clearance. And of course, so far as the lease arrangements are concerned, the site owners have been very careful to ensure that none of the existing commercial occupiers have any long-term security. So they can be given notice readily, so the site can be available and can be cleared in a relatively short time. We've covered this in Mr. Whipperman's statement. This is G7AZ of the 11th of December, and so you have it in writing there that that there isn't any security so far as existing commercial occupiers are concerned on sow and grow. So far as the southern part of the sow and grow site is concerned, there are 2 dwellings there, but they're owned and occupied by the Armiger family, who of course are the overall owners. The family are the overall owners of the sow and grow site. So far as the northern part is concerned, as you may have picked up, there's a divide between the 2 ownerships. Mrs. Dunbar, who has the northern part, she has a dwelling house there, and the remainder of the Dunbar part of the allocation is garden. So there isn't any difficulty there with regard to the site becoming available for development. Again, it's a fairly easy site to clear. The sow and grow area and the Dunbar ownership are divided by a private right of way, which gives access to the allotments at the rear, which Mr. Quilter has already mentioned. That we think will have to remain. So it divides the allocation rather neatly into these 2 portions. Plainly, from what I've said, it'll be seen that Mrs. Dunbar's parcel at the northern end is the simplest one to develop. But we don't see any substantial difficulties in making this overall allocation available in the short term. And I mean, this is reflected in the statement of common ground. So I endorse what Mr. Quilter had to say with regard to boundaries, and also with regard to the elimination of the sliver of greenbelt, which has been dealt with by the recent proposed modifications. We're entirely in support of that.
So where are you in terms of a planning application, and is it expected that there'll be one planning application for the site?
Yes, the clients. No, I don't think there will be. I think it'll be 2 planning applications, one for the sow and grow area, the Armiger ownership, and in all probability one for the Dunbar ownership. That hasn't been settled yet, but the Armigers, the owners of sow and grow, and Mrs. Dunbar, as is evident from there being a single agent and my acting for them both, they're on entirely amicable terms. But as I've said, the 2 areas will have to be developed separately because of the private right of way that runs between them. It could be a single application, but I think it's more likely it'll be 2 separate applications. The Dunbar portion of the site, the northern part of the site, would obviously be attractive to a smallish developer. That's an easy small site fronting onto the Ongar Road, which a small developer could take on readily, one would have thought.
And when is it envisaged then that the planning application or applications would be submitted? Well,
certainly, so far as sow and grow is concerned, the Armiger ownership, as Mr. Quilter has mentioned, and I confirm what he said, there'd been pre-application discussions about it, but of course they couldn't proceed because of the green belt. position. But there's been preliminary work done. My expectation would be that application would be forthcoming as soon as the plan was adopted. There's no barrier to that. It is within my personal knowledge, and I think that it's alluded to in Mr. Whipperman's paper, G7AZ, that the armigers are very anxious that live discussion should take place with the developer and an application be submitted just as soon as the plan is adopted, so that they're ready to go.
An application in outline or a full application?
Well, given the size of the site, we're not talking here about a massive site that needs to have a master plan. I would see no reason why there shouldn't be a full application. It doesn't need an outline application with master plan approach. It could go to full application. But I emphasise that's my view. I don't have a firm instruction on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dagg.
Thank you.
Just more. Oh, Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Wright, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wooden. Just before we move on from that, can you just clarify if a developer is actually interested in that site? Have there been any discussions?
There have, yes, there have been discussions, but as will be apparent, that they haven't been progressed, of course, because of the greenbelt status of the site. But it is within my.
But there is interest.
Oh yes, it's within my knowledge that there has been. Yes.
Thank you very much. That's it. Thank you.
Can I just ask you just a question on the in relation to the policy BC part of policy that talks about the setting of the historic park and garden site at South Wheel Park. Just so I can understand that, how would that impact upon a development proposal on the site, or how would a proposal expect to take account of that?
Thank you, Inspector. Certainly, I'd say it was very. It's obviously distant from the site. It's not adjoining the site. It's the wider context, I think, obviously, that was trying to highlight there. But I think we can accept that there wouldn't necessarily be any significant issues created as a result of considering that. But obviously, the distance that's between this site and the historic park and garden certainly isn't of major concern.
Does the boundary of that historic park and garden sit beyond the field, beyond the allotment?
Yes, so it's in terms of where it's situated, it covers the South Weald Country Park, but there is a road called Sandpit Lane, so that there's a field so to the west of the allotments. There's a field there, then there's Sandpit Lane, and then you've got the boundary of the historic park and garden. So there is that distance between them.
And the allotments themselves, obviously not part of the site, but they're currently accessed, I think, to the north of the Sow and Grow nursery.
Yes.
So what is envisaged in terms of the access to the allotments as part of the development of this site?
I think they would remain as they are. I mean, Mr. Dagg may want to come in on that one, but as I understand it, that access would not be impinged.
Mr. Dagg, is there anything?
Yes, I'd confirm that that's right. Yes, I mean the position, so far as both the armigers and Mrs. Dunbar is concerned, is that private right-of-way has to be safeguarded, and it will be preserved as it stands. I mean, there may be some opportunity to improve its appearance and its surface, but that's something obviously we'll have to take on board when we get to detailed design stage.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't have any more questions on that site. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Dagg. And Mr. Dagg, you're welcome to stay or welcome to leave, whatever you feel you wish to do. can we turn to the next site, which is land at Maskell's Lane, please?
Okay.
So this is a very small site, and I don't intend to spend very long on this site. But Mr. Coulter, can you just explain to me again? It's a greenbelt site, and I've seen the very helpful representation made by the landowner. But just explain to me, what are the exceptional circumstances that justify the release of this site from the greenbelt?
Thank you, Inspector. So in terms of the site, the residential development site at RO8, we believe it would relate well to the existing urban area of Worley, which is part of the main urban area of Brentwood. It's because the site displays very limited countryside characteristics and has a strong contribution with the existing urban form. Residential development in this location would have a strong relationship with the existing urban area and would be separated from the countryside by Maskell's Lane, a strong boundary feature, which already limits the openness of the site. So the site makes minimal contributions in terms of achieving greenbelt purposes, which is a factor that goes towards demonstrating exceptional circumstances as to why this particular parcel has been chosen for release. The overall assessment rating demonstrated that this site made a low, moderate contribution to the purposes of the greenbelt.
Thank you. Just look at the only question I've got is about the critical drainage area. There's some in the statement made by the Stone Bond. It says it's not located within a critical drainage area. We just confirm what the situation is regarding the critical drainage area.
Thank you, Inspector. So I'm just reminding myself of the statement of common ground.
So I was looking at the representation.
Oh, apologies.
By the
right.
Stone Bond, sorry.
Right, no, my mistake. Apologies. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, so obviously that's their position in respect of that, but obviously we would respond. The reason we've provided that requirement within the policy is in response to what Essex County Council's lead local flood authority have identified in terms of the requirement to consider that further. And obviously we accept that the size of the site would obviously limit the amount that would be able to have a significant amount of scheme to it, but clearly it would need to be a consideration as part of a planning application in consultation with the lead local flood authority about the appropriate measures that would need to be brought in place to ensure there's no net negative effect from that site.
So the reference in the policy that it's located in the critical drainage area is correct and needs to stay in?
Yes, that's. I mean, we had no objection from the county council to it being included. If anything, they've asked for that, so that's our position.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions on that site. Thank you. Can we turn to R09, please, at Worley Hill? And there is a statement of common ground in relation to this site. So, Mr. Coulter, could you just explain, because this is another site that situated in the Greenbelt, and I understand that it relates to development of the former hospital site that has taken place in part in the past. So could you just please explain to me, just introduce the site and explain to me what the exceptional circumstances are that that would justify this site from release of this site from the Greenbelt. I've got some questions in relation to boundaries, but if you could just explain to me what justifies the release of this site.
Okay, thank you, Inspector. So yes, this site is part of the former Worley Hospital complex. Obviously, as mentioned, the original Worley Hospital was redeveloped. I can't think of the exact timings, but probably about 10, 15 years ago. This is a remaining piece of land within the control of the Essex Partnership University NHS Trust, and it comprises, there is a number of buildings on the site which were former accommodation, as I understand, and those are they're currently, I say, vacant, not being used, and their access, there is access roads within the site. So from the northern part, there's the road to the north that they access, and there is also a smaller secondary access to the south onto Warley Hill. In terms of the surrounding uses, we have there's woodland to the west of the site, which is owned by the council or managed by the council as well. And in terms of as mentioned, obviously the hospital to the northwest, and then we've got the existing residential areas to the northeast, and there's a business park to the southeast of the site. In terms of the exceptional circumstances, so the site was assessed in the Greenbelt study as having a moderate impact in terms of achieving Greenbelt purposes overall. There will be, in our view, a limited perception of urban sprawl as a result of the release of the site for development, as the site itself shares characteristics with the existing urban form. So in terms of the buildings, as mentioned, and the wider countryside. The site is previously developed partly with existing mature woodland along the western boundary, which reduces openness to the countryside beyond. So I think in our view, I'm assuming we'll come on to that in terms of the boundaries, but the woodland certainly provides a strong boundary from our perspective, and actually within the site there's need to look at obviously the way the development can be integrated within the existing vegetation on site.
The boundary of the site is fairly, I describe it as fairly jagged as you'd look at it on a plan, and I can understand in respect of it following boundaries, but can you just explain to me why you consider that boundary which is fairly jagged and is not easy to define, particularly in respect of some elements of the site on the western side of the proposal? Why that boundary is appropriate, and how you've arrived at that boundary in looking at the appropriate area of land to take out the Greenbelt?
Certainly. So yes, I agree. Obviously, in terms of there's not necessarily uniformity to the boundary lines. I think it's fair to say also, obviously looking at it in plan terms, yes, it is jagged, but the actual the edges are very much vegetation. Obviously, as I mentioned, there's existing mature woodland on those, particularly on the western boundaries. That would soften those edges in reality in terms of the actual perception. The actual openness would be reduced by that, in the sense that you're not going to perceive the site from looking easterly from another direction further in the west. And equally on the northern sides, there are strong existing natural defendable boundaries, I believe, in terms of how that site would be contained. I think it's also fair to say that there is a wall that runs along the edge of Warley Hill itself, that the site is in effect contained within. So there is an element of, again, in terms of that perception looking outwards into the site, that there wouldn't necessarily be the reduction in openness in our view as a result of that. But yeah, the boundaries clearly do follow the ownership of the site. And bearing in mind that the green belt does carry on to the north there in terms of in front of the previous former use of the Worley Hospital, which has now been converted to residential. But in our view, the boundary is still justified.
Thank you. Mr. Butler.
Thank you very much, Inspector. And I'd completely agree with Mr. Quilter in respect of the boundary. I think it is fully justified, and it is a strong, defendable boundary. I'd also like to draw attention to a statement that was made in our hearing statements. At paragraph 2.17, I've referred to the fact, incorrectly in fact, that the woodland to the west is SSSI protected woodlands. That is in fact incorrect, but it is a local wildlife site and ancient woodlands, and that is reflected in document C31 in the Council's examination library, the local wildlife site review. And it very clearly shows the boundary of the local wildlife site Clements Wood on page 124, which indeed on the site's western boundary is quite jagged. So it follows that strong physical feature.
So what physical features does it follow on that western side?
A strongly defined woodland edge. It's easier to see from within the site itself. Obviously, if you look on a Google aerial images, you see the tree canopies and things obstructing the view, but it's very clear to see from within the site itself.
And in terms of that boundary being enduring for the long term, what evidence is there that is actually the appropriate boundary that could hold for the long term?
Well, I think the fact that we've got a local wildlife site in ancient woodland is pretty strong evidence. But on top of that, I would also draw attention to the master plan strategy that accompanies our Regulation 19 representations, which follows that boundary and very clearly shows that the development would take account of that. So that can be accounted for as part of forthcoming planning application and the development strategy. So I have every confidence that would endure into the long term.
Thank you. Can you just tell me how this site relates to the already developed part of the hospital site, some of which I think has been developed for housing, but how does this site, how would it relate to those other parcels of land that have been developed in the past?
So in terms of the and Mr. Butler can come in in more detail, but there is obviously the connection in terms of its proximity to the former Worley Hospital site. And then there are, through the woodland, as I understand it, there's public access that people can walk through that. And I think through the proposals that have been drawn up and shown in the master plan work Mr. Butler referred to, clearly there'll be a requirement to enhance some of those access, or if not create more. So I think that there's an opportunity there to create a relationship with the two sites. Obviously, currently the site is sectioned off because obviously it's private land. But I think in terms of its development, there are certainly opportunities to integrate that into the wider area.
the access, the site now is down to a fairly defined point in relation to the access. What is the confidence that actually that is? And I know it's an existing road at the moment, but what confidence is there that access point is correct and for example doesn't need to take any more land in order to access the site from Pastoral Way?
Yeah, I think that we're confident that is achievable. I think it's also important to highlight that there has been previous pre-application discussions for this site where we've obviously this master plan has been informed by, so that's confirmed that is possible. And equally, as mentioned, not necessarily be the primary access, but there is opportunity to utilise the existing secondary access further down to the south of the site, whereas I understand the intention was to redevelop the larger unit that is on the site at the moment. That would be sort of principal access for that. But certainly the actual primary access is considered achievable.
So the policy says that development should be from Pastoral Way. Is that still correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, I mean, my mention of the secondary access is purely from the point of view that's obviously there at the moment, and it would very much be a lower level access that wouldn't be considered to be the primary route at which people would access the site. But in any case, if that's not achievable, we think it would be. But the actual principal primary access would be able to serve the entire site.
Okay. The policy refers to preserve the settings of nearby listed buildings, and I understand that the tower and the lodge are listed buildings. Can you just explain to me how the setting of those listed buildings relate to this development?
Certainly, yes. So yeah, there is the listed buildings to the north of the site. Again, former buildings associated with the former Whalley Hospital, and that again is more reason why this additional work that we went through, in terms of that we advised the promoters to go through that pre-application discussion in conjunction with her historic a heritage officer to give that advice in terms of whether, and that really was testing in terms of, we'll come on to it, but testing again the capacity of the site, because I think obviously there's a consideration there in terms of making sure the capacity is compatible with the need to ensure the setting of those buildings is taken into account. Obviously, notwithstanding that as an application comes in, there would need to be compliance with those other policies anyway relating to heritage. But certainly in terms of making sure that this allocation is reasonable in terms of what it's setting out, there has been consideration of that before finalising those policies.
So the tower is the tower that's on the site. Is that listed?
Yes, that is. Yes. I think, to be fair, it's probably more along the lines of why that's been included. It's obviously from the point of view of the Greenbelt boundary, being appropriate to release that from the Greenbelt. There's not the intention to develop that that's in different ownership. As I understand it, again, Mr. Butler may be able to correct me on that, but that's separately owned.
So, Mr. Butler.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, it is in separate ownership. It doesn't fall within the ownership of the of my clients. It does fall within the allocation area, but itself, you can see it has its own strong Greenbelt garden boundary and so on. So it's I would also add as well that has been taken into account in the initial pre-application discussions that we've had with the planning authority, including the conservation officer, and just referring again to the concept master plan strategy that we've undertaken. The general approach has been agreed with the conservation officer, subject of course to detailed design considerations.
So just to explain why that site, why that water tower site is included within the site and is supposed to be released from the Greenbelt. What was the reason for running the greenbelt boundary along the back of that garden boundary, as it were, rather than leaving that outside of the site and forming the site boundary between the water tower and the proposed development site itself.
Sure. So I think in terms of the way that as we mentioned earlier, in terms of those wooded edges of the site, there is obviously some woodland to the rear of the water tower. And I think in terms of if that was to be left within the greenbelt, certainly would feel that wouldn't meet the purposes, whereby it would be an isolated parcel left within. As you come into the site, it clearly would make up part of the site because it currently has that relationship. So I think from our perspective, it was logical to include the boundary of the water tower, which abuts existing vegetation that provides that definitive boundary.
Thank you. So if we look at the capacity of the site, there are, and you've helpfully explained the relationship of the water tower and the nature area to the west of the site. But how have you derived the capacity of 43, taking account of those site-specific considerations? And also related to that, is this a figure? Is this a net figure? And what assumptions have you made in respect of the loss of the existing, I presume, residential properties on the site? Or perhaps you could enlighten me on that.
Yes. So as I understand, as mentioned earlier, the existing buildings on site were institutional use. So they were, and obviously they're not currently being in active use and haven't done this for many years. So in our view, the net amount would be the 43 units because those existing buildings don't form a formal residential use as such. In terms of the total quantum for the site, as I say, we've been guided by that process which was undertaken earlier on in the plan making process, recognising that the need to allow for areas of land or effectively to allow for the areas of land to accommodate the setting of key buildings like the water tower within the site, and also the relationship with that and the surrounding woodland. So I think in terms of what we've been through that process, the site promoters have come to that conclusion, which has been, like I say, principally with our heritage officer, and their view that is a reasonable prospect for the site.
Because that would be dense. Well, it's a 1.6 hectares, 43 units.
Yes.
Mr. Butler.
Thank you, Inspector. Just to provide clarity on the net number of dwellings, the site was originally developed in the 1930s and initially provided staff accommodation, but more recently it was used for various NHS care-related purposes such as a drop-in service and care for people with learning difficulties. So in our view, there is no net loss of existing residential dwellings on that. So from our perspective, that is just to agree with the council on that. 43, 43 dwellings. Also as well, and I just draw attention once again to the master plan strategy that accompanied our Regulation 19 representations. It's been drawn up, taking a landscape-led approach to the development of this, lovely site. Arboricultural evidence, ecology evidence, obviously access and heritage have all been taken into account in order to provide a broad mix and type of dwellings that accord with the council's housing requirements.
What stage is is the planning of that site up to? Given that in relation to the now expected trajectory, there would be 20 houses delivered in 22, 23, 23 and 23, 24. Where is the planning of that up to in terms of the preparation of a planning application, the expected submission of a planning application? What I'm trying to look at is what is the likely prospect that that site will actually develop that level of housing from 22, 23. Mr. Butler, you had your hand up. I'm sorry if I didn't come back to you, but I don't mind who answers that point. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I don't mind who kicks off on that point I just asked.
I'll let Mr. Butler come in on that one.
Okay, yeah, I can tackle that one. Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, no, we think the lead-in times are perfectly appropriate. My client is the landowner, and they are unlikely to build the developments out themselves. But we anticipate bringing forward an outline planning application later this year. I'd also just add into the mix that the market here is very strong, and we've already received market interest in the site. So we don't foresee any difficulties in delivering it. Just coming back to ecology again, we're currently undertaking species-specific ecology surveys to be able to launch into a pre-application inquiry basically once this local plan examination process is complete. So that'll be in the spring at some point, with a view to then undertaking the outline planning application later in the year, subject of course to local plan adoption. But my client is very keen to progress with the development of the sites.
Mr. Coulter, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Inspector. Now, I think in terms of what Mr. Butler's outlined, I agree with that. The site is considered to be deliverable with no overriding constraints to bringing that forwards. Even though there are existing buildings on site, they are fairly spaced out and there's not many of them, and I think that would obviously not take very long to clear the site. So I think we feel that that's a reasonable prospect in bringing that forwards.
So if the planning application came in once the local plan was adopted, and that application was in outline, is it realistic that there will be 20 houses delivered in 22, 23?
Well, I think also it's fair to say that there's obviously the possibility that applications can be advanced in advance of the plan being formally adopted, notwithstanding that the greenbelt wouldn't be formally removed until adoption. So certainly the council is open to having those discussions to advance the application as quickly as possible. In any case, I think obviously the delivery of 20 units within the 22-23 financial year period is still considered to be a reasonable prospect, notwithstanding the fact that, as mentioned, the site hasn't got any overriding constraints to otherwise to bringing the development forwards. So it's only really greenbelt at the moment that is preventing that.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't have any more questions on that site.
Sir, could I just raise something? I meant to do it before John Dagg.
Yes, Mr. Sheriff David. Yes.
Thank you. Before John Dagg left the examination, I don't think he's here anymore. But it's a recurring theme throughout all of these policies, and it's a way in which the policy is worded. And you will see that they all say development proposals should consider the following. Put yourself in a section 78 position and you're trying to see how this policy actually requires anything to be done or sets parameters. Of course, it tries to do that. But of course, merely requiring proposals to consider something really doesn't cut the mustard. And so the policy should either be setting parameters or requiring certain things to be delivered as part of the overall development. So what I'm doing is redrafting all of the allocation policies which use this this wording in order to make it effective, because at the moment the requirement to consider something is not effective in policy terms. There will be consequential but minor changes to the way in which the policy is structured after that, but nothing that goes to the heart of the policy or its criteria. I just wanted to make that clear now to anyone who's participating, because we're going to go on in other sessions to discuss this with other people, and we can make the same point again.
Thank you, Mr. Shardavian. Mrs. Wright?
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Just on that point, Mr. Shadaravian, obviously we have the F9A suggested modifications in front of us, and that's where changes to the policies have been set out. Obviously, we will consider whether those are necessary for soundness reasons or for legal compliance, etc. But within those, obviously, the council has already suggested wording changes to take out that reference to consideration and actually make it much more, this is a definitive requirement and this is what we want developers to provide. So again, just to assist anybody who's listening in or is waiting in the wings for the other site allocations that we'll be going through, please ensure that you do look at the suggested modifications. They're not the main modifications, let's make that clear, in relation to the recommended modifications that we may or may not bring forward, but do have a look at the F9A document that the council has provided. Thank you.
I'm grateful.
Thank you. We have one more site to deal with this morning, which is Donninghurst Road. What I propose to do is just take a quick break and return to that, and then we shall finish the session and then have a break before the West Horndon session. So if we take a quick 10-minute break now, it is just gone 11:05. So if we return at around about 11:16, and then we'll move on to Donninghurst Road. Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome back, everybody. Nobody hear me? Okay. Can we turn to Doddinghurst Road, please? And Mr. Quilter, if you could just again introduce the site for me. And again, this is a site that does rely upon release from the Greenbelt. So if you could please explain to me what are the exceptional circumstances that would justify its release from the Greenbelt. So I can't hear.
Apologies.
I thought it was me.
That.
No one else.
I'll click the button there and down anything, so apologies. Yeah, so I'll start again. Thank you, Inspector. So yeah, the residential development sites are 16 and 17 were assessed in the Greenbelt study as having a moderate impact in terms of achieving Greenbelt purposes overall. There would be a limited perception of urban sprawl as a result of release of these sites for development, and the sites share characteristics with the existing urban form, and obviously in relation to the northern site with Pilgrim's Hatch and the southern site with Brentwood, north of Brentwood. Release for the sites would not result in development extending further east than Doddinghurst Road, a strong boundary feature. And obviously between them is the A12, equally providing a strong boundary. So in terms of the openness of the site wouldn't be affected, openness of the Greenbelt wouldn't be affected in our view on the release of these sites from the Greenbelt. And so these particular specific local level characteristics are factors that justify the selection of the sites for release from the Greenbelt in the Council's view. Did you want me to just quickly describe the sites outside of the context?
Please, that would be very helpful, yeah.
Yep, no worries. Obviously, as the parcels are, so we've got R16 and R17. I'll deal with the northern site first. So that sits to the south of Pilgrim's Hatch. It's bounded by existing developments on Highgrove, Bishop's Hall Road and Viking Way. Doddinghurst Road is on the eastern side, which is where the access is proposed to come out onto. And on the opposite side of Doddinghurst Road is the Brentwood Centre, which is owned by the council. The southern parcel is backed onto by a number of existing roads of development. There is opportunity for access onto Doddinghurst Road, which is as stipulated in policy, as set out in the Statement of Common Ground. There's also the potential for access onto Carron Close and Russell Close, but the principal preference from the council, and as I understand from the as we've set out in the Statement of Common Ground, is the Doddinghurst Road. But they're happy to have any questions on that.
Thank you. So in terms of the capacities, what is the how have you calculated the capacities expected from both parcels? I mean, they seem to be quite different in their nature. One is open fields and the other one is more woodland scrubland. How have you worked out the capacities, and how can we be confident that that is the expected yield from the site?
Certainly. So yes, you're right to distinguish the two. And the northern parcel clearly will have the majority of the development, and the southern parcel would be of a lower density in sort of trying to accommodate the existing characteristics of the site. So in terms of obviously the original, as for the majority of the sites, we have been informed by the healer in terms of assumed density capacities, and equally from discussions with the site promoters. There is obviously, as set out in the Statement of Common Ground, a recognition has been put forward by the developers or site promoters, that the site could accommodate a higher number. But in terms of the numbers that we've put within the plan, the 200 figure, we feel that that's an achievable prospect in terms of the combination of those two sites. Obviously, our view is that that's a reasonable prospect of that coming forwards.
Thank you. Mrs. Dudley-Smith.
Hi, yeah, it was just a point of say on behalf of Countryside to sort of re-emphasise on some of the points that Mr. Quilter's just made there. As you will no doubt seen within the hearing statement submitted for this matter, prepared by ourselves. I think we've undertaken early sort of feasibility and capacity study work, which has generally, to our developer, directed us towards unit numbers likely upwards of 200. And I think, for example, at a much earlier stage in the local plan, in the 2016 draft, for example, the sites were in fact considered for delivery at 250. But during the sustainability appraisal stage and sort of in acknowledgement of the potential for some constraints on the site, that unit and that total number has been brought down to 200. And as Mr. Coulter referred to, I think our client are accepting of this on the agreement that the definitive capacity will obviously be informed at planning application stage when there's detailed consideration made of the various site constraints and how those can be mitigated or not.
Thank you. Mr. Minot?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Warden. I've got a number of things that I'm going to be saying about this site, but just on the subject of, to start with 89A, as it were, the green belt, the release from the green belt. I know that the 2005 local plan regards Brentwood and Pilgrim's Hatch as already being continuous with one another. I have to say, my perception is that there's an issue with that, and I have issues about the way in which well, one of the things that's particularly striking about this is if you look at the way the plan deals with what it calls urban neighbourhoods. Pilgrim's Hatch is regarded as being an urban neighbourhood. The plan also talks in terms of Hutton, Brook Street and Worley being urban neighbourhoods, and they clearly are simply urban neighbourhoods of Shenfield and Brentwood. They're completely continuous. They're just names for parts of the towns. Pilgrim's Hatch is almost entirely surrounded by greenbelt, all bar the one little bit right next to the Ongar Road. So it would be very interesting to know what the percentage of the boundary of Pilgrim's Hatch as it currently stands is in terms of greenbelt. So the decision to remove the greenbelt designation from the small section that we're talking about here is actually a significant decision. There's also the plan has talked about green wedges, and it's talked about green wedges between Brentwood and Shenfield. I noticed that in F9A there's removals to reference of green wedges, which I'm curious about. But I'm also interested by the way in which, whilst the plan has emphasised, previous iterations have emphasised green wedges between Brentwood and Shenfield, which I have to say, when you're on the ground, it's quite difficult to notice, although I have no objection to there being green wedges and preserving those green wedges. There's been no interest in preserving the green wedge, which is effectively this land, the remaining green wedge between Brentwood and Pilgrim's Hatch. And I think it's also worth saying, in terms of, obviously, the National Planning Policy Framework talks about one of the reasons for the existence of the green belt being the prevention of the coalescence of settlements. We can argue about whether the two settlements have coalesced or not, but the other aspect of this, which we can get onto a bit later on, is the wildlife corridor aspect, because currently the openness of the land, both on the north and the south of the A12, is acting as a wildlife corridor, since you also have open land on the western side of the settlements quite close. If any wildlife wanted to come through, this would be the corridor that it would use. So you have to look at the removal of the greenbelt aspect of this land and the destruction of some very significant biodiversity values, particularly on the southern side. I'm almost certain on the northern side as well. Under those headings, but again, we can come on to those. I've got various other things to say under the other subheadings of section 89, but that's where we are at present as far as the green belt boundaries are concerned.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. Mr. Coulter, are you able to respond to that?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. So just dealing with the points in turn, in terms of obviously the release of this site, as mentioned, obviously our view is that in greenbelt terms, the site is well contained. In terms of the the references to the wedges of greenbelt, so to speak, obviously it is greenbelt regardless of our sort of labelling on that. The mentioning of that was obviously just a characterisation, I suppose, of the greenbelt that comes on the other side of Doddinghurst Road, and obviously all the way across the northern part of Shenfield and Brentwood into the town centre location. Obviously, the point being is that we were looking at strategic greenbelt release in terms of, or strategically, so we're looking at how greenbelt can be released. And this site does fall within a category where we feel it's an appropriate location to do so. In terms of its labelling, again, of urban neighbourhoods, or if it's any other label, obviously the point being is this is an urban extension to the main urban area in the same fashion as other sites that we've identified, so I don't think there's necessarily a distinction between those. Apologies, I've forgotten the last. The wildlife point. In terms of that side of it, the site is not designated, and obviously there would be a requirement, as for any application, as subject to the plan being approved, an application coming forward that need to obviously assess that impact if there was any accompanying wildlife assessment. So I don't have any view on, obviously I appreciate that there is a view put forward there about the level of biodiversity on site, and clearly any site would need to assess that, and in terms of any appropriate mitigation. But from the point of view of releasing it as an allocation, we've had no consultation responses from statutory bodies identifying that as a significant concern, and obviously we'd still require the appropriate assessment at the appropriate stage.
Thank you. Can I just ask a question in relation to Mr. Minot's point? I think about coalescing of the settlements and the sort of the value of the greenbelt sites at the moment as greenbelt in providing a green area, an undeveloped area between Pilgrim's Hatch and Brentwood. Can you just explain to me what you think the value is of the sites at the moment as greenbelt? That the two sites together effectively is a chunk of greenbelt. I know that there is existing housing to the west, which sits either side of the A12, but in terms of the value of these two parcels of land as greenbelt.
So from our perspective, yes, the Pilgrim's Hatch area and Brentwood are part of the main Brentwood urban area in the same fashion as Shenfield, Worley, the Brook Street area are all part of that main urban area. Obviously, clearly, this is currently at greenbelt designation, and the first principle being how we've selected sites sequentially is we're not looking to look at greenbelt as the first instance. We have tried to maximise brownfield locations to avoid as much as possible, but then of course going down that list we then need to look at where, because we do need to provide our housing needs, and obviously it does require looking at releasing greenbelt. It's then the most appropriate locations, and I think in terms of this location, as mentioned, obviously the fact that it is so well contained in both instances, that this is in our point of view, that it is obviously an appropriate location to release the greenbelt. The actual coalescence of those two settlements has already occurred. I do appreciate, obviously, it is greenbelt and need to assess that. It has been assessed, but the actual the impact of the loss of that greenbelt is considered to be minor.
Would you say its value is heightened by the effectively the coalescence on, I think it's on Hurstwood Avenue, Viking Way area to the north, and then the area to the south? Do you think the value of it as greenbelt is heightened by that coalescence either side of the A12 to the west, or do you think it reduces its value?
I don't think it's been heightened. Obviously, from our perspective, it's the fact that the two settlements have already coalesced. It's obviously a consideration, but from our perspective, the containment of the site is equally another factor that needs to be considered in that regard. So I think from our position, that from a greenbelt release terms, the actual effect on openness, which is one aspect that we need to look at, is not going to be significant.
Thank you. Mr. Dudley Smith.
Hi, yeah, it was just to re-emphasise, I think, Mr. Coulter's point there, and I think we'd be in agreement to suggest that you can't really define coalescence by sort of more or less coalescence. Either two settlements have coalesced or not, and from our perspective, I think we view it that given the existing relationships of existing residential development either side of the A12, be it in Pilgrim's Hatch or Brentwood to the south, that we'd just be continuing that sort of development pattern that's already in place.
Okay. Just going back to the question of how the capacity of the site has been derived. Mr. Minot yesterday, I think, referred to environmental considerations of the A12. And so can you please explain to me how you've taken that and other considerations into account, but particularly that point that Mr. Minot raised yesterday about the A12 in respect of noise and other considerations that might require more of a buffer.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Inspector. So as was mentioned earlier, the proposal originally in the 2016 version of the draft local plan did set out 250, but as Ms Dudley Smith highlighted, obviously the sustainability appraisal did identify the sort of potential impacts in broad terms, obviously as much as it can do in terms of the impacts of the A12 on that development site. So certainly the number was reduced down in the subsequent 2018 preferred site applications to 200 in recognition that there would be a need to provide potentially more buffering on the A12 boundaries. But obviously the point being that the site promoters believe that the site could accommodate a higher number, but it would be subject to those more detailed assessments that would accompany an application. But in terms of an allocation, we feel that the 200 figure is an appropriate figure to rely upon.
Thank you. Mr. Minot?
Yeah, sorry. Clicking and unclicking various things. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I didn't mention yesterday, but which I think is very much worth mentioning, is that there are, as far as I can see, only 2 of the preferred sites in the whole of the borough and the whole of the local plan which have a red rating as far as air quality. As it happens, they're both in my ward. They're both in Brentwood North, and this is one of those sites. The other one is Waits Way, which we'll get onto on another day. Personally, I have to say I find it very difficult to understand how a site which has got an existing red rating for air quality, where you've got a main trunk route like the A12, which is on ground level. The ground level changes, so in one place it's above ground level for the northern part of the site, but it's either on ground level or above ground level for this site. And particularly as far as the southern part of the site is concerned, when you're effectively talking about a very narrow remaining strip between existing housing and the road, it's very difficult to see how you can do very much in terms of development on the southern side at all if you are actually going to pay any attention to air quality and to noise for residents, for potential new residents. I mean, the point is the southern strip of regenerated scrubland is acting as the air quality scrubber and the noise buffer for the existing housing. If you take away the wooded scrub on the land, you're almost guaranteed to be worsening the environmental situation for the existing residents, and also putting, however much housing you put in on the south side, putting in housing which will have substandard amenity in terms of air quality and noise. And the same would obviously go for a significant strip on the southern edge of the northern part of the site. I mean, I think one of the fundamental things that I would say about this particular site is I find it very difficult to see how you can both accept the wider, the more general plan policies which the council has drawn up, which in when you read the wording of them, they are excellently worded. They subscribe. They say that the council is subscribing to all sorts of excellent things in terms of environmental quality and protecting the natural environment and enhancing biodiversity and all of these sorts of things. It's very, very difficult to see how, if you develop parts of this site at all, you can do any of those things. So you either say the policies mean what they say and you don't develop parts of this site, or if you do develop parts of this site, you effectively have to throw out the application of the wider policies which are supposed to cover the whole borough in terms of parts of this site. The fact that this site was put forward and taken all the way through and has become part of the accepted sites list, in my view, is totally contradictory in terms of some of the more fundamental policies. And so, I mean, you've got the air quality and you've got the sound issues, and you've also got very significant issues in terms of, in my view, in terms of the ecological considerations. And I'm particularly bothered by what you read in the sustainability appraisal, because it's admitted in the sustainability appraisal that it hasn't been possible to draw on locally commissioned work to identify further areas of constraint and opportunity, particularly sensitive local designated wildlife sites. Or in the original version, in the version that was actually agreed in November 2018, it also said, or other areas contributing to green infrastructure. And in my view, this area definitely does. And it also admits, the sustainability appraisal also admits, this is Appendix 3, Table A, that there is no data to support appraisal on climate change mitigation and insufficient evidence to enable a robust analysis. Effectively, the local plan as it currently stands is saying either the council or other people haven't been able to do detailed work or in terms of, biodiversity, quality of various sites. That's not necessarily work that needs to be done for absolutely every site, but I would argue that there are certain sites where work of that kind really needed to be done in order to ensure that it made sense for those sites to be going forward as viable, meaningful sites in terms of the context of the overall plan and its overall policies. And in my view, this is one of those sites, and that work hasn't been done. I was quite struck, actually, in relation to the discussion on Worley Hill, by the commitment to undertake a species-specific ecology survey prior to outline planning application going in. In my view, and I have to say also, there was some environmental destruction which took place recently on the southern side. I think it was a year and a half ago, which I was very much concerned about because I started to think somebody recognises there's potential biodiversity quality here and they would like it not to be there once later discussions take place. So that is to be significantly deprecated. In my view, nobody has properly assessed the biodiversity, the wildlife value of these sites, particularly the southern one. I've spoken to residents because it's my ward. There are people who live literally right next to it. They have seen foxes there. They believe there are badgers there. There's all sorts of bird life there. It's regenerating scrub. It's a land type which obviously doesn't exist very much in the southeast of England, given the density of development. And in my view, it's a site that needs to be looked at. Obviously, it's not a local wildlife site. It hasn't yet been investigated, but it absolutely needs to be investigated before a consideration could be made that it would be an acceptable development site. And that just doesn't seem to have taken place.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. Ms. Dudley Smith or Mr. Coulter, Miss Dudley Smith, you got your hand up, and then I asked Mr. Coulter to respond to the points that are made.
Okay, thank you, Inspector. It was just a couple of additional points to come back on some of these matters and provide a bit more context on. In terms of ecology specifically, Countryside Properties have actually previously undertaken a phase 1 habitat survey of the site, and the results of that confirmed that the majority of habitats identified on the site were either of low value, common or widespread habitats that are commonly mitigated for and kind of managed through development sites and through detailed species surveys.
So when you say the site, you mean the 2 parcels of land, don't you?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so all of the preliminary technical work that's been done by Countryside Properties so far has encompassed both parcels as one site, so all surveys have covered both of those parcels. It does, of course, as anyone would expect, recommend further species surveys to be undertaken at the appropriate times of year, and obviously would need to be required in advance of any planning application should the local plan be adopted. I'm sure Countryside Properties would be happy to share any of that information that's currently available, if that would be of assistance as well. Just on some of the sort of noise and air quality queries mentioned. Again, I think on all of these matters, it's important to consider the fact that there is a national house builder engaged in both of these parcels of land as the site, and they're highly experienced in mitigating site constraints and bringing forward developments that can work amongst recognised constraints. In Countryside in particular, there are sites that we have worked with them on the past, so can vouch for that, that have been in very close proximity to the A12, for example, and the A120 in Braintree district. Again, if there's if it would be helpful to provide more information on those, then we can certainly do that. The matter of the fact is that it's, particularly in terms of noise as a starting point, I suppose it's something that can be mitigated through design and layout from our perspective. Obviously, there's different methods of mitigation in the interest of internal noise standards and external for amenity spaces and enjoyment of public spaces. Both have their different ways of doing that, which we could go into more detail again if needed. In terms of air quality, we've actually had dealt with the similar matters recently, as you may or may not be aware of the Epping District Council local plan, and I think there was a common acceptance there of the NO2, so nitrogen dioxide, and PM10 particle matter, which are the two sort of commonly accepted measurable factors relating to air quality in terms of the relationship they have with human health. Do drop very quickly over distance, and so as you come away from the main roads, the levels do decrease significantly, and on that basis, and obviously an assessment of the proximity of existing development that is already in place along the A12, that's it's sort of on that basis that we understand that in the past, or in this particular instance, that was accepted as considered acceptable, and there was no further queries from the inspector on that matter. Again, on both noise and air quality, some preliminary desktop assessments have also been undertaken by Countryside to start to grasp the potential constraints in that regard, and what the implications of that may have on site capacity, deliverability, and the requirements that may be needed in terms of mitigation. And as I say, that's again information that I'm sure could be provided if helpful.
Thank you. Before I ask Mr. Quilter to come in, Mr. Minot, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to come back after Mr. Quilter if that would be more appropriate. But just in terms of what's just been said in terms of the drop-off of air quality over, or the improvement of air quality over distance, I have to say I think it's quite interesting that the entire site has been rated as red in the sustainability appraisal, because I mean I think there's also an issue about the fact that these, what are clearly two sites, have been regarded as one site. There's no other site in the entire local plan where parts of it are divided by a trunk road, where parts of it are totally inaccessible from one another. They literally couldn't be accessed from one another, clearly without building a bridge, and nobody's going to be doing that. No site which is divided by a railway line. In this case, you've got a site which is effectively two sites, but because of a decision at the beginning of the process to only assess greenbelt areas which were relatively large greenbelt areas, and because the greenbelt area on the south of the A12 was a very small pocket of greenbelt, it was lumped in with the greenbelt land to the north of the A12, and so it was never properly assessed by itself as a small pocket. And particularly if you look at the land to the south, because it's such a narrow strip, that drop off of air quality, or the improvement of air quality as you get further away from the road, you have to start asking questions how much of that narrow strip is actually available for use if you have any serious commitment to maintaining air quality and lack of noise for new building, new properties. So, I mean, I'm happy to let Mr. Quilter or any other officer have a say. I'm not trying to hog this, but just in my view, the more you examine it, the more issues there are. And it doesn't seem to me that the way this site has come forward and the way it's being proposed is taking on board the constraints, the really serious constraints that exist on the site. I think the fact that the housing number dropped from 250 to 200 is starting to acknowledge that there are clear issues here. But I don't think they've fully been understood or acknowledged even now.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. Mr. Coulter, could you please respond to add to anything that Ms. Dudley-Smith said, but please respond to Mr. Minor's initial questions and then the points he's raised now. And I'd like you to focus on what you expect to be consistent with an allocation, and then what you would expect to be consistent with the planning application. Should the site be allocated in local plan, what you'd expect normally to be within the planning application to help address some of the points that Mr. Minor has raised.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful to go through that distinguishment between the two, because obviously what we're dealing with here is obviously an assessment for the point of view of actually allocating a site in a plan, and then there'll be further detailed information required for a planning application. So obviously we understand that point. I think in terms of the AQMA, I would point you to document F5J, which does outline the summary of what the Brentwood Council Air Quality Report sets out, that recommends that the AQMA in this location is revoked based on the recent data that's been gathered for that location. Obviously that hasn't happened at this stage, and that's why the SA process in terms of that GIS analysis, and I would emphasise that is a GIS analysis, and it wouldn't be as fine-grained as distinguishing between one part of the site compared to another. It simply looks at where there is the proximity of an AQMA. In this case, as I mentioned, that one is to be revoked as recommended. That would obviously result in a red on that score, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's not the possibility of that site being mitigated. I think it's also fair to say that we believe that the capacity of that site, as we've mentioned earlier, allows for the appropriate mitigation to take place. And there have been other locations where development and in many places around the country where development has taken place alongside roads. Now, clearly, obviously, that does create those issues to resolve, but they are resolvable. In terms of the point mentioned about the local wildlife, the wildlife site, apologies, got that wrong way around, the R09 reference, and obviously we've already discussed that, but the mention of the policy specifically are requiring impact assessment on the ecology impact assessment. The reason for that in that location is because it actually adjoins a local wildlife site. Now in this location we aren't talking about a designated site, so that's why that wasn't mentioned, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there wouldn't be a requirement through the planning application process for the appropriate assessments to take place. And I think it's also important to highlight the document C31, where the council has undertaken a review of local wildlife sites, and there are recommendations which we're following through for new local wildlife sites to be identified on the policies map. So obviously that has been that assessment that carried out in terms of where there is appropriate locations to recognise where formal designations need to be put into place, that has been followed through. So I think that we've covered that.
So could I just add that in terms of the sustainability appraisal, the only red the site scores is in relation to the AQMA, which has been explained to you. All the rest are amber with one green, and that could be found on page 100 of the essay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherwood-Davian.
Apologies, Inspector, just in terms of the reference I made to F5J, it's paragraph 14, and the AQMA in relation to this site would be AQMA 4.
So the council has resolved to rescind the AQMA, but that just hasn't been enacted yet.
No, so it's a recommendation within the air quality report. Obviously, that's still to be followed through.
Sorry, could I just clarify? Is this F5J?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yep, thanks.
Can I quickly provide an update on that one? Just a very quick update, inspectors.
Yes, please, yes.
So in F5J, at the time that we provided that note, the monitoring report of 2020 wasn't published. However, that is now published, and it has stated in the report that the council proposes to revoke all of the remaining AQMA. So that is now published online on SXA and on the council's website as well. So if needed, we can provide that documentation.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Minor, you've got your hand up. Was that?
I think that one was a relic. I'll take it down for the moment.
Thank you. In relation to the yield, you've explained that you expect the capacity to be less than you might have thought originally it would be, and it's 200. But now, in terms of the statement of common ground, you are, unlike some of the other sites, you're actually suggesting that the site could start earlier than you might have envisaged previously. What is the reason for that? And given it's a greenbelt site, given that site surveys that has been referred to would have to be carried out, etc. Why bring the site forward to 22-23 start? And what evidence is there that suggests that would be reasonable?
Thank you, Inspector. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the original trajectory, just remind myself. I think obviously we were setting out from a period of 2023-24 onwards. In honesty, I think that was obviously something that was overlooked at the time, and obviously the recognition in further ongoing discussions that the site doesn't. There are obviously a requirement for mitigations, but they're not unusual. And I think obviously in terms of the delivery timeframes, we are now setting out an annual delivery rate of 50 per year, whereas previously it was sort of 50, 100, then another 50 over a 3-year period. So I think it's sort of following those discussions that have been outlined for the statement of common ground that it's felt that is a reasonable prospect of bringing that site forward. We are talking about a site that is there's no existing development to clear on the site. Obviously, any mitigation, as with any development, would be required to be brought forwards. But we feel that is a more realistic delivery timeframe for this site, as outlined for other sites as well of similar nature. So it would be effectively it's trying to ensure consistency between the way that we've approached other urban extension sites of a similar nature.
Thank you. Ms. Dudley-Smith.
Yeah, just to re-emphasise on that, really, that as Mr. Coase emphasised, we've actually, been consistent in our representations on behalf of Countryside from the site of the original trajectory, that it's a site that we would expect to be able to be delivered in a short term. We've, as already mentioned, we've undertaken a significant amount of preliminary site work, and again, with the fact, this is Countryside as a national house builder are incredibly experienced in terms of delivering sites at a fast pace and understanding what the requirements are for before applications can be submitted and delivery commenced. So that all of those discussions and that wealth of experience has been what's informed our consistent representations in that regard, and the final sort of conclusions in the statement of common ground. We do have evidence of delivery rates achieved by Countryside Properties that we can either provide in due course, but we also, I would just mention, we've got Mr. Glossop on the call now. If it's considered that it'd be helpful to have some input directly from Countryside Properties on that.
Just tell me when you think the planning application will be submitted.
So, as Mr. Coase mentioned earlier, we would be keen to be working with the local planning officers and the development management team to be working on a planning application potentially ahead of the adoption of the local plan in anticipation of a positive conclusion, and that would enable site survey work to be being undertaken this year, and therefore I don't see whether there'd be any reason that a full detailed plan application couldn't be submitted either immediately after adoption or early into next year, 2022.
And that would be for both parcels of land?
That's the current expectation, is that would be for one full detailed planning application to cover both parcels, yes.
Okay.
They're both under the same ownership and engaged under the same option agreement, so Countryside are able to operate with them as sort of one entity in that regard.
Thank you. Can I ask a question in relation to the access? Because I've got a question in relation to the northern parcel, which I'll come on to, but the southern parcel, there's reference in the Statement of Common Ground now to access being suggested through Russell Close and Cowan Close. Can you tell me why you're suggesting that, please?
Is that a question to me? Sorry.
Well, I mean, is that the council's position, or is that Countryside's position?
The position of the council, as I set on the policy, is that access will be off Doddinghurst Road. The position of the site promoter, I'll let Ms Dudley Smith come on to that, but it's that they want the flexibility applied to that, so it allows for the potential for Cowan Close and Russell Close to be utilised. That's their position.
But is that the council's? That's what is the council taking?
We're happy to be flexible. I think because in terms of, obviously, as it's mentioned there isn't necessarily specific evidence against that. It's obviously subject to further detailed planning application being submitted on that basis. But there's the Highways Authority would need to provide them that more detailed view on the detailed application. At this stage, in terms of an allocation, they feel the site's achievable based on the access requirements.
Okay. Can I just hear from Mr. Johnson, please, in terms of the Highway Authority, just very quickly on that.
Yeah, good morning, Inspector. We've only considered this site from a point of view on access off Doddinghurst Road, because that was what was put to us, and we took the view that a safe access could be provided off that. Looking at it, I mean, it's possible that access could become off those minor roads, but immediate thoughts would be to think maybe that should be maybe more pedestrian cycle type access rather than vehicle access. But that's purely from a consideration of local residents and such like. But yes, our view has just purely been looking at it from what was in the plan, which was access off Doddinghurst Road, which we think is achievable.
Thank you. We're running a little bit late here now. I've not got many more questions on this site, but we will then need a break before we start the West Horndon site, principally to allow IT to make the right connections. Ms. Deeney.
Hello, thank you for letting me speak. Obviously, we're due to start 12 o'clock in another session. IT will need about a 5-minute break in between just to set it up, and I will let those participants know. But did you have an approximate time that you think the rest of this session would take?
I would take another 5 minutes.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dudley Smith, let's just hear from you in respect of the reasons why you think the policy should allow for access from other points apart from Doddinghurst Road for the southern parcel.
Yeah, so the key point, Inspector, is that request for the flexibility. I think it's common. It is a common understanding between ourselves and the council that everyone's preference would be for the principal accesses to come off of Doddinghurst Road. I think it's just in the absence of any technical evidence that demonstrates that it would be technically unfeasible to come from Karen Close or Russell Close. We'd like to protect that flexibility, even if it is, as Mr. Johnson referred to, in the interests of ensuring sort of pedestrian cycle connectivity and or possibly even sort of minor accesses to smaller parts of the development in the interest of kind of integration into existing development. But yes, we're happy to confirm that we do very much view the access from Doddinghurst Road as the sort of an achievable and prioritised preference, I suppose.
Thank you. And in respect of the access on the northern part, the boundary of the land to be taken out of the Greenbelt site narrows down to right in the north eastern corner of the site. Are you satisfied that access can be taken within the land that is shown to be moved from the Greenbelt?
Yes. So I think there's significant or substantial enough frontage along that part of the site to allow flexibility in that regard. I don't envisage any problems there.
Mr. Shardavian.
Thank you. I was just going to say, actually, we could build in some flexibility into the policy in terms of access. So we could, for example, under BA, refer to principal vehicular access via Doddinghurst Road, which would leave then discretion as to where secondary accesses might be taken. That word alone will do the job. As long as you are happy that the site is accessible via Doddinghurst Road.
Thank you. Mr. Minot. Also, Mr. Johnson, might be on this access point.
Yeah, just to say that the Highway Authority has not considered it in any detail, of those minor roads. So, you know, we'd be slightly reluctant to agree to what Mr. Shadaribian has just said if we haven't properly assessed it and reviewed it. And as I say, it wasn't on the table when we considered this site. So, you know, we would rather go in our way and have a good look at it first.
Well, just to give some reassurance, all I'm saying is principal access. It doesn't commit anyone to any alternative access in a principal manner or any secondary access, which would have to be determined by the planning application stage. So just to give you that assurance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Minot, you had a hand up.
Yeah, a couple of points. I mean, firstly, I would say this adds to the potential question as to whether this site is deliverable quickly. I'm very interested to hear what Mr. Johnson's just said in terms of the fact that access anywhere other than off Doddinghurst Road wasn't considered when the site was put forward. I think it's also worth saying, particularly again for the southern part of the site, access off the Doddinghurst Road there would put you in a situation where the access point would be the road. Doddinghurst Road is dropping away to get underneath the A12. You've also got a bend which is occurring. You're also in a situation where the land which I know Tesco's own on the other side of Doddinghurst Road, where they would like to build 450 houses, but fortunately the local plan is not saying they should be doing that. The access point for their land and the only possible access point for that land would be pretty much directly opposite this on Doddinghurst Road. So you'd almost certainly have to have some kind of, I don't know, mini roundabout at least, I would have thought, to have access for significant numbers of housing on the eastern side of Doddinghurst Road if it ever came to be, as well as having access for housing off Doddinghurst Road on the western side there. I suspect the residents, the existing residents, would probably prefer access of Doddinghurst Road, or they might do, because it would mean that they wouldn't have the extra traffic coming through Russell, Karen Close and St Kilda's Road, which they both run off. But obviously, I think it's also worth mentioning that the original idea, I mean, that scheme was a scheme which was going to have gone further and to have used up what's still now Greenbelt land. So Russell and Karen Close were built open-ended. So they do obviously just run into the open scrubland. But I go back to my point about whether this site is a site which can be delivered quickly. I think there are serious questions about that.
Thank you. Any final points from the council?
Thank you, Inspector. I think I would just emphasise, obviously, the appreciating that we're not talking about emission sites, and obviously it's not a proposal in the plan, so the Tesco land is not a consideration as part of this. That would be for a future plan to consider if it was needed. The access is considered appropriate by the County Council, as Mr Johnson just outlined. So I think from our perspective, the Doddinghurst Road access, whether it says principal or not, is an appropriate access.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions. I don't have any further questions. And so we'll end this session now, and we'll take a break, and we'll start the West Horndon session when Ms Feeney advises me that we can do so. Ms Feeney, are you able to help us in respect of how...
Hello there. It's currently 12:06. Should we restart at 12:15?
That's fine.
Lovely.
Does that give IT sufficient to get time?
Yes. Okay. Lovely.
Okay. Thank you very much to everybody for your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.